I had just inherited $35 million and was speeding home on the highway to share the news with my daughter when a brutal accident landed me in intensive care. Shockingly, my son-in-law never visited, dismissing me as a useless old fool. Days later, he showed up with his mistress, but she screamed, "Oh God, this is my—" Little did he know, this was the beginning of my ultimate revenge. Before continuing, subscribe to our new channel, where we tell stories of husbands and wives taking revenge on their insolent children, sons-in-law, and daughters-in-law. My name is Ray Forrester. I am 68 years old, and I live in Nashville, Tennessee, in a 2-story house on Cedarwood Lane that I bought back when houses on that street still cost what houses should cost. I spent 35 years as a senior archivist of rare documents at the Nashville Public Library before retiring 3 years ago. People assume that kind of work makes you quiet and dusty. They are half right. I am quiet, but I notice everything. When you spend decades handling documents that other people dismissed as worthless, you develop a certain instinct for things that matter more than they appear. I apply that same instinct to people now. It saves time. I have one daughter, Diane, who is 39 and smart in ways she has temporarily forgotten. Her husband is Derek Powell, 41, a real estate agent with a firm handshake and the kind of smile that makes you check your wallet afterward. They have been married 9 years. For the last year and a half, they have also been living in my house, after what Derek described as a rough patch financially. I described it differently in my own head, but I kept that to myself, which is something I have always been good at. Derek established his personality in this house within the first 2 weeks. On a Sunday morning, I made a simple breakfast, eggs and toast, the way I have always made it. Derek looked at the plate, then looked at me, and said with a generous smile, "Ray, no offense, but this is the kind of breakfast they serve at a roadside diner that closed in 1987. Diane laughed nervously and said, "Dad, he is just joking." I nodded and ate my eggs. They were fine. I have made them the same way for 40 years, and I intend to continue. 2 weeks after that, Derek looked at my truck in the driveway and said, "That thing still runs? I'm genuinely impressed. It is like a museum piece, except museums usually have things people want to look at." I told him the truck had 140,000 miles on it and had never left me stranded. He said that was a low bar. I agreed, thinking of him specifically. The comments about my pension were my personal favorite. Every time money came up at the dinner table, Derek had a way of glancing at me with this expression, patient and slightly pitying, like a man watching an elderly dog try to climb stairs. "Retirement must be peaceful," he said once. "Simple life, simple needs." He meant it as an insult. I accepted it as an accurate description of why I sleep well. Diane, through all of this, would go quiet, or redirect the conversation, or occasionally offer something like, "Derek, come on," in a tone that carried approximately 0 weight. She is not a cruel person. She is a person who has spent 9 years learning to see her father through her husband's eyes, and those eyes are not kind. I love my daughter. I also know that love sometimes requires patience measured in years, not weeks. The morning of the 3rd day of March started the way most of my good mornings do. I was up before 6, had coffee, fed the neighbor's cat, who has decided my porch belongs to him, and drove downtown to the offices of First Tennessee Title and Notary on Church Street. The reason for the visit was something I had told nobody in that house, not Diane, not certainly Derek. 3 months earlier, I had been contacted by an attorney in Florida regarding the estate of my mother's second cousin, a man named Gerald, who had lived quietly in Sarasota and died without a spouse, without children, and apparently without anyone who expected anything from him. Gerald had, however, accumulated considerable assets over his lifetime in a manner that suggested he shared my family's preference for silence over display. The inheritance came to $35 million. That morning I signed the final confirmation documents. I sat in the notary's parking lot for about 4 minutes before pulling out. $35 million is a number that requires a moment. I'm not a man who gets dizzy easily, but I will admit the February air felt different walking back to my truck. I merged onto I-65 North, somewhere around noon, heading home. I was thinking about Diane, about how to tell her, about what that conversation would look like and whether Derek would be in the room when it happened. I was thinking about Howard Blake, an attorney a library colleague had recommended, and whether I should call him before or after talking to Diane. I was thinking, if I am honest, about the look on Derek's face if he ever found out. I was not thinking about the commercial truck that came across the lane marker at exit 87, with no functioning brakes and approximately 40,000 pounds of momentum behind it. The sound was not what you expect. It was not a boom. It was a compression, like the world closing in from one side, and then metal finding metal, in a language that has no translation. My truck went sideways. The window beside me became something else entirely. I remember thinking, with the clarity that apparently arrives in the last available second, that I had not called Howard Blake yet. Then there was nothing. No sound, no road, no $35 million, just the dark, and somewhere at the edge of it, a voice I did not recognize, calling a name that might have been mine. They tell me I was unconscious for 3 days. I have no reason to dispute that. What I can confirm is that when I opened my eyes, the ceiling above me was institutional white, and the smell was the particular combination of antiseptic and recycled air that belongs only to hospitals. I was in room 412 at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, which I later learned is one of the better places in Tennessee to find yourself after a highway collision, which is modest comfort. The inventory of damage, as delivered by my doctor in the tone of a man reading a grocery list, was as follows: 3 cracked ribs on the left side, a moderate concussion, and a fractured left collarbone. Nothing that would kill me, he said. Nothing that would heal quickly either, he added, as if I needed the balance. I thanked him and asked about my truck. He looked at me the way doctors look at patients who say unexpected things. I told him it was a reasonable question. The nurse assigned to my room was named Clara, a woman in her 50s with efficient hands, and the kind of face that gives nothing away unless she decides to give something. She came in about an hour after I woke up to check readings and adjust a line in my arm. I asked her if any family had come. She kept her eyes on the monitor. I asked again. She said that my sister had arrived that morning and was sitting in the corridor. Then she said nothing else, and the silence after that was the kind that answers questions without words. My sister Norma is 72, drives a 15-year-old Buick, lives in Murfreesboro, and has been the only consistently honest person in my life for as long as I can remember. She came in wearing her blue coat and carrying 2 oranges, which she set on the bedside table with the seriousness of a person making an offering. She sat down, looked at me for a long moment, and said, "You look terrible." I told her that was the concussion's fault, not mine. Then I asked about Diane. Norma pressed her lips together in a way I have known since childhood. It means she is deciding how much truth the situation requires. She decided on all of it. Derek had called the hospital once, on the first day. He had not asked about my condition. According to Clara, who had taken the call and was apparently still processing the experience, his first question was whether I had an insurance policy on file and whether a beneficiary had been named. Clara had answered carefully. Then in the same call, not knowing that Clara was still listening, Derek had said to someone beside him, in a voice carrying no particular effort to be quiet, that the old fool deserved it for driving like a madman. Those were not his exact words, but the meaning was accurate, and the tone, Clara told Norma later, was the tone of a man who had already moved past concern into calculation. Diane had not come. Derek had told her the accident was minor, had told her I was being dramatic, had told her with the confidence of a man who has practiced managing information that I was the kind of person who exaggerated for attention. I lay there looking at the ceiling and did not cry, because that was not what the moment required. What the moment required was arithmetic. I began adding things up quietly, the way I have always done, the way you do when you have spent a career understanding that the value of a document is often hidden in what is not written on its surface. I thought about a morning from a long time ago, before Diane had married Derek, when she called me from her apartment at 7 a.m, just to tell me about a bird she had seen outside her window. A cedar waxwing, she said, and she described it for 4 minutes with the specific joy of someone who still believed small things were worth reporting. I had written it down in the back of a notebook. I still have that notebook. That was Diane before she learned to see me through someone else's prescription. I thought about the first Christmas Derek spent in that house, which was also the last Christmas where the table conversation felt easy. He had held court for most of the dinner about a development deal he was working on, a piece of land outside the city that was going to make him significant money. He had used the word significant 4 times in 20 minutes. I had counted. The deal, as far as I later learned, had not materialized, but the confidence was still fully intact. I thought about the way Diane had looked at me when I questioned something Derek said once. A small thing, a number that did not add up. She had looked at me the way you look at someone who has embarrassed you in public, quick and pained, and then she had changed the subject. I had not questioned anything out loud since. I had simply started writing things down instead. Norma was still sitting across from me, watching my face the way she has watched my face for 68 years. She knows what I look like when I am thinking. She did not interrupt. Finally, I asked her to do one thing. I asked her to go out to the nurse's station, get my phone from whatever bag or drawer my belongings were in, and bring it to me. She asked if I was sure I was up for calls. I told her I was not making a call. I was looking at a number I had saved 2 years ago and had not dialed once in all that time, for reasons that seemed sensible then and felt like wasted time now. She came back with the phone. I unlocked it and found the contact. No name attached. Just the number and a note I had written to myself beneath it, in the small text field where you can add a label. The note said, "When you are ready." I looked at the ceiling again. 3 cracked ribs, a fractured collarbone, a daughter who had not come, a son-in-law who had asked about insurance before asking if I was breathing. I decided I was ready. The number belonged to a man named Sam Holloway, and before I explained why I had it saved under a note that said, "When you are ready," I need to go back about 12 years. My second marriage lasted 4 years. Her name was Patricia King, and I will say this about her. She was not a bad person in the ordinary sense of the word. She was a person who wanted things I could not provide, not money, not security, but a particular kind of attention that I have never been equipped to give. I am a man who goes quiet when things get complicated. Patricia needed words. We ran out of them somewhere around year 3. The divorce was completed on a Tuesday in a downtown courthouse with less drama than a trip to the DMV. What Patricia took with her when she left was a 4-year-old girl named Vanessa. I want to be honest here because honesty is the only thing I have left that I fully own. I was not a good father to Vanessa in those years. I was present in the physical sense, but I was the kind of present that fills a chair without filling a room. When Patricia left and took Vanessa to somewhere that turned out to be difficult to find, I told myself I was respecting the distance. What I was actually doing was accepting a door that had been closed in front of me and calling it someone else's decision. That is a distinction I have had years to examine, and I do not like what I see. Patricia changed her last name twice, first to her mother's maiden name, then to something else entirely when she remarried. Vanessa grew up as Vanessa King, which was Patricia's original surname, the one she had held before our marriage. For years I searched with the tools available to a retired archivist with no investigative training. Records requests, public databases, a great deal of time, and very little result. 2 years before the accident, I hired Sam Holloway. His office is on Broadway, Suite 208, in a building that smells like old coffee and ambition in equal parts. Sam is not the kind of private investigator you see in films. He is a quiet man in his late 50s, who wears reading glasses and takes notes by hand. He found Vanessa in 11 weeks. She was 34 years old, living in Nashville, working in marketing and going by the last name King. Sam brought me a photograph, an address, a workplace, and a concise file of what her life looked like from the outside. I had sat with that file on my kitchen table for a long time. I knew which coffee shop she passed on her way to work. I knew she drove a gray sedan and kept the same parking spot. I knew from the photo Sam had taken from a reasonable distance that she had Patricia's cheekbones and my eyes, which is a combination I found difficult to look at directly. I had not called. I had not driven by. I had done nothing because the version of rejection I could most clearly imagine was the one where she already knew who I was and had decided, clearly and finally, that she did not want a father who had taken 12 years to show up. I was afraid of her answer in the way that only someone who knows they deserve a bad one can be. Now I was lying in a hospital bed with cracked ribs and a fractured collarbone, and the ceiling above me had stopped offering useful information, so I called Sam Holloway instead. He picked up on the second ring. I told him where I was. He said he had seen the accident report and had been wondering when I would call. That is the thing about a good investigator. He pays attention even when you are not paying him to. I gave him the new task calmly, the way I used to approach a document that needed cataloging. Find me everything currently visible about Derek Powell's finances, bank accounts where traceable, credit activity, any business transactions in the last 18 months, any property deals in progress. I told him I was particularly interested in anything connected to my home address on Cedarwood Lane. And then I added the secondary question, almost as an afterthought, though nothing I said to Sam that morning was actually an afterthought. I asked whether Derek was seeing anyone outside his marriage. Sam said he would start immediately. He asked if there was a deadline. I told him I was not going anywhere particularly fast, given the collarbone, but that sooner was better than later. Norma came back into the room about an hour after that, with a cup of coffee she had obtained from somewhere down the corridor, and a look on her face that said she had been in the hallway long enough to hear some of what I had said. She sat down and did not ask questions, which is one of the many reasons I am glad she exists. I spent the rest of that afternoon thinking about Derek's performance at the dinner table over the past 18 months. The confident numbers, the deals in progress, the significant land. I thought about the way he had looked at my house, not as a place where someone lived, but as a structure with an accessible value. I thought about the way he talked to Diane about me when he thought the walls were thicker than they were, the dismissals delivered in the particular tone of a man who has already decided an obstacle is temporary. When you read documents for a living, you learn that the content people leave out is often more informative than the content they include. Derek had left out a great deal over the past year and a half, and I had been writing all of it down in a notebook I kept in a locked desk drawer, the same way I kept everything that mattered. The next morning, before 7, my phone rang. Sam's voice had the specific texture it gets when he has found something that surprised even him, and Sam is not easily surprised. He said he needed me to hear something before I heard it from anyone else. He said that Derek was, in fact, seeing someone. Had been for at least 8 months, based on the pattern Sam had already established from a quick preliminary look. Then he paused, and Sam does not pause unless the pause is doing work. "Ray," he said, "your son-in-law has a woman, and you are not going to believe who she is." I asked Sam to say the name. He said it quietly, the way you deliver information that has structural consequences, and for a few seconds, the hospital room felt smaller than its actual dimensions. Vanessa King. My daughter, who had grown up not knowing me, or knowing only the absence of me, was the woman Derek had been seeing for 8 months. The man living in my house, eating at my table and making commentary about my eggs, had walked into a situation that was either the most unlikely coincidence in the history of bad judgment or a joke told by the universe with no concern for the audience. I did not say anything immediately. Sam waited, because Sam is good at waiting. Then I told him to document everything he had so far and to continue. I told him the financial picture was still the priority. I needed numbers, contracts, anything with Derek's name and a dollar figure attached. Sam said he would have a preliminary package ready within 3 days and would bring it to the hospital, personally. I put the phone down and looked at the 2 oranges Norma had left on the table beside me, still untouched from the day before. They were beginning to look philosophical. Norma arrived at 8:30, earlier than usual, wearing an expression that preceded news. She had driven back to her apartment the night before, but had passed by Cedarwood Lane on her way, she said, just to check. Just the way Norma checks on things, quietly, without announcing herself. The same method she had used my entire life to make sure I was still standing. Derek, she told me, had made 2 phone calls from the house that she could partially hear through the front window, which was apparently open despite the March temperature, which I found consistent with Derek's general relationship with other people's property. The first call, she believed, was to an insurance company. She had heard my name and the word policy and the phrase current beneficiary status, delivered in the smooth tone of a man who had done his research on what questions to ask. The second call was to Diane, and she had heard Derek's side of that one more clearly. He was telling my daughter that the hospital stay was being handled, that I was not in any real danger, and that the priority right now was making sure someone had authority to manage things at the house in case bills came due while I was incapacitated. He used the word incapacitated with what I imagined was visible satisfaction. I asked Norma what Diane had said. Norma had not heard Diane's side, only Derek's, but she said his tone was the tone of someone who had already won an argument before the other person knew it had started. I knew what was coming before she said it, the power of attorney. It is a document that sounds administrative and functions as a key. Derek wanted Diane to sign something that would give him management authority over my assets while I was in a hospital bed. He had dressed it in the language of practicality, water bills and utilities, the everyday machinery of a house that needed minding. That is the thing about a certain kind of person. They understand that most people cannot distinguish between a reasonable request and a strategic one when the framing is sympathetic enough. I told Norma to listen carefully. Under no circumstances was anyone to sign anything on my behalf. Not Diane, not anyone. If someone showed up at the house with documents and a pen, she was to call me immediately, regardless of the hour. Norma said, "I know Raymond," in the voice she uses when she's already been 3 steps ahead of me for several days. Then I made the second call of that morning. The number for Blake and Sims was in my phone from the conversation I had been planning before the truck on I-65 interrupted my schedule. Howard Blake had been recommended to me by a colleague from the library, a woman named Judith, who had used him for her mother's estate, and described him as the kind of attorney who reads everything twice and charges accordingly. I told the receptionist it was urgent. She put me through. Howard Blake has a precise voice, the kind that suggests he measures sentences before he delivers them. I told him I was in room 412 at Vanderbilt, that I had recently confirmed an inheritance of significant size, and that I had a son-in-law who was currently attempting to establish document control over my assets while I was incapacitated. I used the word deliberately, because it was his word, and I wanted him to understand that I had been listening. Blake said he could come that afternoon. He arrived at 2 o'clock with a laptop, a small digital recorder he asked permission to use, and a leather folder that looked like it had attended serious meetings before. He pulled a chair close to the bed, and we talked for 2 hours without interruption, which Clara managed by redirecting foot traffic with the quiet authority of a person who has seen complicated situations and chosen a side. I told Blake everything that was relevant: the inheritance, the unsigned documents still in process, the household situation, the power of attorney attempt, and the general outline of what I suspected Derek's intentions were. Blake listened, typed occasionally, asked precise questions, and did not react dramatically to any of it, which I appreciated. Dramatic reactions are for people who have not yet understood the situation. Blake had understood it within the first 20 minutes. When we finished, he closed his laptop and sat for a moment in the manner of a man organizing conclusions into sequence. He said he had enough to begin immediately, and that there were several instruments worth discussing at the follow-up meeting, which he wanted to schedule for the following week. He picked up his leather folder, added the printed pages I had signed, and stood. I watched him walk to the door. At the threshold, he paused in a way that was not entirely procedural. He turned back, looked at me with the expression of a man who has just assembled a picture from its separate pieces, and then he nodded once, slowly, as though confirming something he had suspected, but needed to see in full before he could believe it. Then he walked out, and the door closed behind him, and the folder in his hand contained the beginning of something that Derek Powell had not yet imagined was possible. The evening of the 7th had settled into the particular quiet that hospital hallways get after 9 o'clock, when the daytime traffic of visitors and administrators thins out and the building remembers what it is actually for. My ribs were doing their nightly commentary which I had come to think of as fairly reliable editorial feedback on the general situation. The pain was manageable. My head was clear. Those two facts together put me in the best condition I had been in since the truck on A65 had introduced itself without warning. Clara came in at 9:30 with the look she gets when something is about to require her professional neutrality. She straightened the monitor cable that did not need straightening, and then said, without meeting my eyes directly, that there were two visitors at the floor entrance, a man and a woman. The man had said he was family. I knew before she finished the sentence that Derek had finally decided to make the trip. 4 days after the accident, which meant he had calculated that waiting any longer would look suspicious even to Diane. I told Clara to send them in. She nodded and left, and I adjusted the pillow behind me with the one arm I could use efficiently, and waited. Derek came through the door first. He was wearing the dark jacket he reserves for occasions when he wants to appear like a man who takes things seriously, the jacket that has never actually accompanied any serious undertaking that I observed. He was holding his phone in his right hand, screen down, the way people hold phones when they want to look like they set them aside, but have not actually set them aside. He glanced at the monitors, then at the window, then at me, in that order, which tells you precisely how much of his attention was organized around concern for my welfare. "Ray," he said with the warmth of a man reading warmth off a card, "you look better than I expected." I did not say what I was thinking, which was that his expectations had probably not been set very high. I said Derek, and left it there, because I have always found that a name delivered without additional weight tends to unsettle people who were expecting either hostility or forgiveness. He got neither. He stepped further into the room and half turned back toward the door. "I brought someone," he said in the casual tone of a man introducing a colleague at a work function. She came through the door while he was still speaking. I had studied Sam's photograph more times than I would admit to anyone, in the particular way that you study a face you are trying to prepare yourself to see in 3 dimensions. The photograph had done reasonable work, but photographs are flat, and the woman who stepped into room 412 was not. She was moving slightly behind Derek's left shoulder, looking first at the equipment along the wall, then at the window, then conducting the general survey of a person entering an unfamiliar space. Her coat was charcoal gray. Her hair was pulled back. She had Patricia's cheekbones, precise and high, and she had my eyes, which I had recognized in Sam's photo, and now confirmed in person with the specific and complicated sensation of seeing your own face reassembled in someone else. She had not looked at the bed yet. Then she did. The movement was not gradual. It was the abrupt rotation of someone responding to something involuntary, a sound or a pull that operates below the level of decision. She turned and looked at me directly, and for 1 full second, nothing happened at all. The monitors continued. Derek shifted his weight. Clara, who had followed them to the doorway and stopped there with a clipboard she was no longer reading, went entirely still. Then Vanessa's right hand found the doorframe behind her, gripped it, and she said, in a voice that came out somewhere between a gasp and a statement, "Oh God, this is my—" She stopped. The sentence had run into something it could not get past. Her face was doing several things at once, and I had spent enough years reading compressed information to understand the sequence. The first layer was shock, the pure cognitive kind, the kind that arrives before the mind has finished processing the information that caused it. Under that was something older, the particular disorientation of a person encountering a thing they had told themselves they were done expecting. And under that, the layer that was hardest to look at directly was something that resembled recognition of a kind that went past the visual, not just the face, the shape of the situation. Derek had turned to look at her. His expression was the expression of a man watching a play in a language he does not speak, following the emotional register without the vocabulary. He said her name, quietly, with a question in it. She did not answer him. I looked at her steadily, the way I look at documents that require patience. Then I said, "Hello, Ness. I have been waiting for this meeting for a long time. I just did not expect the setting to be quite this institutional." The corner of her mouth moved in a way that was not quite anything, not a smile, not a recoil, but the involuntary response of a person who recognized something in the delivery without wanting to admit it. Derek looked at me, then at her, then back at me. I could see the calculation running behind his eyes, the specific arithmetic of a man who has just noticed that two figures in front of him share a variable he had not accounted for: the shape of the eyes, the particular stillness, the fact that she had stopped breathing the way you stop breathing when you see a face from a long time ago that you had filed under the category of gone. He said, "Do you two?" He stopped, started again. "How do you?" He did not finish either sentence. He stood in the middle of the room with his phone still in his hand, screen down, and watched his careful architecture develop a crack he had not drawn into the plans. Derek left 12 minutes later. I know because the clock on the wall was directly in my line of sight, and I am a man who notices duration. He made 2 attempts to redirect the situation, one by addressing Vanessa in the firm tone he uses when he wants to reestablish the gravity of his presence, and once by addressing me with a version of the family visit he had originally come to perform, some approximation of concern about recovery, and timelines that lasted approximately 40 seconds, before it became clear that neither of the other people in the room was watching his performance. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair where he had placed it, said he would be in touch, and walked out. Clara watched him go from the doorway with the expression of a woman who had seen enough to form an opinion and was professionally retaining it. Vanessa did not move from the chair beside the bed for a long time after that. She had stopped gripping the door frame and had instead sat down in the way that people sit when their legs have made a decision their mind has not yet ratified. She was not crying yet. She was doing the thing before crying, which is the controlled breathing of a person holding a very full container and trying not to spill it. I did not rush her. I am reasonably practiced at sitting with silence. Eventually she said, "You knew." It was not a question. "I found you 2 years ago," I told her. "Sam Holloway. He is a private investigator on Broadway. He took 11 weeks. She looked at the window for a moment. "And you just waited." "I was afraid of your answer," I said. "That is not an excuse. It is just what happened." She turned back to me then, and the look on her face was the complicated one, the kind that has more than one thing in it, and is not interested in being simplified. "You were afraid," she said with a flatness that had work in it. "I spent 23 years thinking you were either dead or had decided I was not worth the search." "I know," I said. "That is all you have?" "No," I said. "But I thought I would start with what is accurate before moving to what is inadequate." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite the absence of one. She looked at her hands for a while. Then she said, "He told me he was almost divorced." That was the phrase. Almost divorced. "He has been almost divorced for approximately 9 years, I said, "during which time he has been entirely married to my daughter Diane." The silence that followed that sentence was a different kind of silence. We talked for 2 hours, not easily and not without long pauses in which one or both of us was doing private accounting. She was angry, and she was right to be angry, and I told her so without qualification. I explained what I could explain and did not attempt to explain what I could not. I told her about the years of searching, the dead ends, Patricia's name changes, the particular helplessness of looking for someone who has been systematically made difficult to find. I told her about Sam's file on the kitchen table and about the photograph I had studied until I could see her face clearly when I closed my eyes. I told her I had driven past the coffee shop she passed on her way to work, once on a Thursday morning in the fall, and had sat in my car across the street for 20 minutes and then driven home without doing anything, because the courage required had not been available that particular morning. She listened. She did not offer absolution, and I had not come asking for it. What she gave me instead, when she finally stood to leave just before midnight, was this. She put her hand briefly on my uninjured shoulder and said, "I need time." Then she picked up her coat and walked out, and I heard her footsteps go down the corridor, and then stop, and then continue. And I took that continuation as something worth holding. While that conversation was happening in room 412, Derek was doing what Derek does when things have moved outside his control. He was acting. I learned this the following morning when Sam arrived at the hospital as he had promised, carrying a brown envelope with the preliminary material and the specific expression of a man delivering both good news and complicated news in the same package. He sat in the chair that Vanessa had occupied the night before and opened the envelope on the blanket at the edge of the bed, the way you spread a map when you are about to discuss a route. Derek had called his contact at the insurance company the previous evening. Sam had reason to believe this from a source I will not specify, which is one of the services a competent investigator provides. The contact had pulled up my policy and had told Derek, in language that I imagine produced a specific and unsatisfying expression on Derek's face, that the named beneficiary on the policy had been updated several weeks prior. The current beneficiary was listed as Norma Gates, not Diane, not anyone connected to Derek by even the most optimistic legal reading. Derek had then, according to what Sam had assembled from the preliminary search, spent a portion of the evening going through the filing cabinet in the study off the kitchen, which I had left deliberately undisturbed in its ordinary state, containing ordinary documents because the documents that mattered were in a coded safe that Derek had apparently located and attempted and abandoned, based on the position of the decorative item I had placed against it as a simple indicator. He had found nothing about the inheritance. He had found nothing useful at all. Sam laid the first pages of the financial summary on the blanket. 3 credit cards, all in Derek's name, all with billing addresses listed as Cedarwood Lane. Total outstanding balance across the 3 accounts, $61,400. The accounts had been opened at intervals over the past 2 years, each one carrying a balance that suggested a man spending at the level of his ambitions rather than his income. I looked at the pages and thought about the dinner table and the deals in progress and the significant land and the confident numbers, and felt the specific satisfaction of an archivist who has located the original document behind the copy that was presented as authentic. Then Sam reached into the envelope and placed the last item on the blanket. It was a copy of a purchase contract, a parcel of land in Smyrna, Tennessee. Purchase price $180,000, signed by Derek Powell as buyer. The transaction date was 3 weeks before my accident. I read through it carefully. The financing section indicated a cash deposit had been made. The source of the cash was not named in the contract itself, but Sam had attached a 1-paragraph note in his precise handwriting explaining that the funds appeared to originate from an account I did not yet have the number for, and that he needed 1 additional day to confirm the details. He did not need an additional day. He called that evening. The deposit account, he said, was registered to Diane Powell. The amount transferred as the earnest payment was $18,000, and the authorization signature on the transfer documentation, the one that had permitted the movement of funds from my daughter's account to a land deal she almost certainly knew nothing about, did not match the signature on file. I was discharged on the 18th of March, which was 11 days earlier than the original projection, a fact that I suspect disappointed at least one person on Cedarwood Lane who had been operating on the assumption that my absence would continue for a more convenient duration. The doctor gave me a list of restrictions, and I gave him my full attention and my sincere intention to honor approximately 2/3 of them. The rib situation remained uncomfortable, but had graduated from what I would describe as loud opinion to persistent commentary, which I considered progress. Norma drove me home. She pulled into the driveway with the careful deliberation of a woman who had been watching the house and had thoughts about what she had observed, and she did not volunteer those thoughts until I was out of the car and standing at the front door with my key in my hand. Then she said quietly, "Derek was in your study on the 14th. I saw the light from outside when I drove past at 7 in the evening." I thanked her and went inside. The kitchen was in order. The living room was in order. The hallway was in order. But I have spent 35 years working with collections where documents are organized according to systems that look casual and function precisely, and I can tell the difference between a room that has not been touched and a room that has been touched and then approximately restored. 3 drawers in the hall cabinet had been opened and closed with slightly less care than they had been opened and closed before. The stack of magazines on the side table was squared at the wrong corner. Small things. The kind of things you notice when you have made a practice of noticing. I walked to the study at the back of the house. The door was exactly as I had left it. The decorative compass rose I had placed at the base of the wall safe, a framed piece from my map collection, had been moved 4 inches to the left and returned to a position that was close to its original placement, but not identical. Derek had found the safe. He had not opened it. The combination is a 6-digit number derived from the catalog reference system I used at the library for 20 years, which I have reason to believe is not a system Derek has ever encountered. I opened it without difficulty. The folders inside were undisturbed. The trust documents in progress, Sam's preliminary reports, and the inheritance confirmation from the attorney in Florida, neatly paper-clipped in the left section. Everything Derek had been looking for and had not found. I allowed myself a brief moment of professional satisfaction, then put my coat back on and drove to Commerce Street. Howard Blake's office on the 4th floor of the building at 220 Commerce Street is the kind of office that inspires confidence in people who are anxious and patience in people who are not. He met me at the door himself, shook my hand with the specific care of a man who had been briefed on the broken collarbone, and had coffee ready before I had settled into the chair across from his desk. He is efficient in the ways that matter and does not talk when the documents can do the talking for him. We spent 2 hours and 20 minutes completing the work we had begun in the hospital. The Revocable Living Trust was finalized. $35 million placed in trust, with Howard as primary trustee and Norma as secondary trustee. The structure ensures that the assets bypass probate entirely, sit outside the reach of any claim Derek might attempt to construct, and are administered according to terms that Derek does not know and has no mechanism to discover. There is a certain elegance in a well-constructed trust that reminds me of a well-catalogued archive. Everything in its place, everything traceable, everything protected by a system that rewards patience and punishes improvisation. The second document took somewhat less time because the principle was straightforward, even if the conversation required to arrive at it was not. The updated will contains a conditional bequest for Diane. She receives her full designated share, but only if, at the time of my death, she is residing independently of Derek Powell. Howard confirmed for the second time that conditional bequests of this structure are valid in Tennessee. He showed me the relevant case citations because I asked for them. I read them at the speed of a man who has read a great many documents and does not skim. "This creates pressure," Howard said, which was not a warning, just an observation. "Diane is a grown woman," I said. "The pressure is not coming from me. The pressure is the situation she is already in. I am simply making it legible." He nodded and moved to the next page. I left his office at 4:30 with signed copies in the folder under my arm, and the quiet, specific weight of a man who has put the important things in order. The sky over Commerce Street was the flat gray of early spring, the kind of sky that has not decided yet what it intends. I drove to a diner 2 blocks away, sat in a corner booth, ate a sandwich I did not entirely taste, and called Sam. I told him I needed the full picture on the Smyrna land deal. The seller's name, the property address, the current status of the contract, and, most importantly, the precise chain of the money, where it originated, how it moved, and whether the authorization on the transfer had been submitted to the bank with documentation attached. Sam said he would need until evening. I told him I would be home. I was home by 6. I made a reasonable attempt at dinner, which my ribs penalized me for by registering a complaint every time I reached for the salt. I sat in the study with the folder on the desk and the map on the wall, an 1847 survey of Middle Tennessee, precise and calm and indifferent to the current century, and I waited. Sam called at 8:47. He spoke for about 4 minutes. I listened without interrupting, which I am capable of when the information justifies the discipline. When he finished, I asked 2 clarifying questions, and he answered both of them cleanly. The earnest payment on the Smyrna parcel, $18,000, had been transferred from an account held in the name of Diane Powell at a bank on Charlotte Avenue. The transfer had been processed with an authorization form attached. Sam had obtained a copy through a source I did not ask him to specify. The signature on the authorization form bore Diane's name, but the letter spacing, the pressure pattern, and the formation of the capital D were inconsistent with the signature on file for that account. The bank's own records showed no in-branch interaction corresponding to that authorization date. It had been submitted remotely, scanned and processed by a back-office clerk who had no reason to question it. Derek had moved money out of my daughter's account by writing her name on a form she had never seen. He had used her money to put a deposit on land that she did not know existed, for a transaction that she had not authorized, to fund an ambition he had been building in the background of her life, while she defended him to her father at the dinner table, and told herself the marriage was worth preserving. I sat with that for a moment. Then I picked up Sam's report from the desk, squared it against the edge, and placed it in the folder beside Howard's documents. In my professional life, I had assembled evidence files on collections of uncertain provenance many times. The process is always the same. You gather, you verify, you organize, and then, when the record is complete, you present it, and you let it speak. The record was not yet complete, but it was getting there. The next morning, I called Sam at 7 and told him I needed the authorization form officially documented, in a format that would hold up in a formal legal proceeding. He said he could have an affidavit prepared by a document examiner he used regularly, a forensic specialist based in Brentwood, who had testified in 2 prior forgery cases in Davidson County. I told him to move forward. Then I called Howard and relayed the same information. Howard's response was measured in the way of a man who is unsurprised, but professionally careful. He told me that under Tennessee Code, annotated Section 39-14-114, forgery involving a financial instrument is a Class E felony. The documented inconsistency in the signature, combined with the bank records, showing no corresponding in-person authorization, constituted a workable basis for a criminal complaint. He said he would prepare the filing and have it ready to submit to the Nashville Police Department within 48 hours. I thanked him and hung up and sat at the kitchen table with my coffee and considered the morning. There are 2 kinds of plans. There is the kind that depends on things going wrong for the other person at random, which is luck, and there is the kind that depends on things going wrong for the other person, because the record documents exactly what they did, which is something else entirely. I had been building the second kind since the evening Sam called me in room 412 with the name Vanessa King, and it was holding together the way a well-sourced document holds together, not with drama, but with the particular authority of verifiable fact. I called Derek at 10 that morning. I told him I wanted to have a family conversation about the coming months, the house situation, general planning. I used the phrase coming months with some deliberateness. He agreed without hesitation, which told me he had been waiting for an opening he thought he could use. He arrived at Cedarwood Lane at 2 o'clock. He came in with the energy of a man who has prepared remarks. He was wearing the dark jacket again. He sat down across from me at the dining room table and put his phone face down and produced an expression of reasonable concern that I expect took some practice to assemble. He asked how I was feeling. I told him I was feeling organized. Then I placed the document on the table between us. It was a single printed page, the bank statement showing the transfer from Diane's account. Below it, clipped, was Sam's summary note referencing the authorization form and the forensic discrepancy. I did not explain it. I placed it, and I sat back and I waited. Derek looked at it. The expression of reasonable concern went through a brief and involuntary sequence. The color in his face moved in a direction that did not suggest confidence. He looked up at me, then back at the page, then at me again. That is a documentation of an unauthorized transfer from Diane's account, I said. There is a forensic analysis of the signature currently being prepared by a specialist in Brentwood. Howard Blake will be filing a criminal complaint with Nashville PD within 48 hours. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, with the tone of a man selecting a different instrument because the first one had not worked, "Ray, I think there has been a misunderstanding about how that account. You have 30 days, I said, to vacate this house voluntarily. After 30 days, I will pursue the matter through the courts, at which point the eviction proceeding will be part of the public record alongside the criminal filing." The room was quiet. The clock on the wall registered it. Then Derek sat forward, and his voice changed to the register I had heard him use twice before, late at night through a closed door, when he thought no one with any consequences was listening. "You want to do this the hard way? Fine," he said. "But before you get comfortable up on that high ground, maybe think about whether Diane knows she has a stepsister, whether she knows you had a whole second family you walked away from. You want to open that conversation, Ray? I am happy to help it along." I looked at him. I will be honest, the first half-second of that was not entirely comfortable, not because I feared it, but because a person who uses someone else's pain as a tool is a specific kind of unpleasant to be in a room with. Then it passed. "Diane can ask me anything she wants," I said. "I do not hide from questions. That has never been my approach." He blinked. He had expected a reaction with more surface area to push against. 30 days, Derek," I said. I picked up the document, squared it against the table edge, and placed it back in the folder. "I will show you out." He left without finishing what he had been building toward, which is the structural weakness of a man who relies on other people's discomfort as leverage. When the discomfort does not materialize, the whole construction loses its foundation. I stood at the window and watched him back his car out of the driveway with more force than was necessary, which I noted without comment. Then I went to the study and sat down. He called me from the car. I let it go to voicemail. The message was not useful. The following morning, Norma called at 8:15 with the specific tone she uses when she has observed something and assessed it, and waited to be certain before reporting it. She said that a car she did not recognize had been parked in front of the house the previous evening for approximately 2 hours, and that Derek had come out twice to speak with the driver, and that the second time he had gone back inside carrying a manila envelope. I called Howard. Howard, it turned out, had already received a call from a colleague at another firm. An attorney named Curtis Vane, who worked out of an office on 2nd Avenue, had filed a motion in Davidson County Circuit Court that morning on behalf of Derek and Diane Powell, asserting equitable interest in the property at 1814 Cedarwood Lane based on a claim of oral agreement and material contribution to the household over the preceding 18 months. The motion requested that any eviction proceeding be stayed pending a hearing. Derek had moved faster than I expected, which I noted as genuinely useful information about his current level of alarm. A man who retains an attorney the same evening he receives a 30-day notice is a man who understood exactly what the 30-day notice was connected to. Howard's voice had the even quality it gets when he is about to explain why something is less complicated than it appears. "Ray," he said, "the property is in your name free and clear. There are no written agreements. The total documented financial contribution from Derek Powell to household expenses over 18 months amounts to just over $3,000 in utility payments. Tennessee courts require substantially more than that to establish equitable interest in real property. This motion will not survive a hearing." "I know," I said, "but now it is filed, and Diane's name is on it." There was a pause. "Yes," Howard said, "that is worth noting." I sat with that for a moment, looking at the 1847 survey on the study wall. The cartographer who made that map had been patient and exact, and had drawn the lines where the lines actually were, not where they were convenient. The record was what the record was. The lines held. Derek had just committed Diane to a legal proceeding she almost certainly knew nothing about. In the same week he had been documented, moving money from her account with a signature she had never written. He was not protecting himself. He was pulling her in front of him. I wrote that down in the margin of Sam's report. Then I called Sam and asked him to check whether Diane had signed any retention agreement with Curtis Vane. The hearing on Derek's equitable interest motion was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late April, in a courtroom on the 3rd floor of the Davidson County Courthouse on 2nd Avenue. I arrived early, as is my habit, and sat in the second row with Howard on my left and a cup of coffee I had brought from home in a travel mug, because the courthouse coffee has never done anything to improve my opinion of the courthouse. Derek came in with Curtis Vane, who was a compact man with a confident stride and a briefcase that looked expensive. Derek himself had dressed carefully. He looked like a man attending an event he expected to win. I watched him scan the room, find me, and do the small, involuntary recalibration that people do when the person they expected to be rattled is sitting quietly with a travel mug. Howard had prepared a 12-page response brief. I had read it twice, not because I distrusted Howard's work, but because I do not hand documents to other people without reading them first. The brief was clean. It documented the property ownership history, the absence of any written agreement, and the full accounting of Derek's financial contributions to the household. $3,218 across 18 months in utility payments, which Howard had broken down per month in a table attached as Exhibit A, because when you have a number that small, you want to make sure the court sees exactly how small it is. Vane argued for about 15 minutes. He used the phrase, reasonable expectation of continued residence, 4 times, and the phrase, good faith material contribution, 7 times. And each time he said either phrase, I watched the judge's expression, which was the expression of a person reviewing a document with no errors, but also no substance. When Howard stood up, he spoke for 8 minutes. He cited 3 Tennessee cases, directly on point. He referred the judge to Exhibit A. He said, with the specific mildness of a man who does not need volume because the facts are doing the work, that $3,200 in utility payments over 18 months does not establish equitable interest in a $410,000 property in any jurisdiction in the state of Tennessee. The judge took 4 minutes to deny the motion. She did it without visible drama, which is the most efficient form of finality I know of. Vellon said something to Derek in a low voice. Derek's jaw moved slightly. He did not look at me, which I interpreted as the specific effort of a man who very much wanted to look at me and was refusing to give himself permission. I finished my coffee and Howard gathered his papers, and we walked out together into the corridor, where the late April light was coming through the windows in long, clean lines. Howard allowed himself a brief professional satisfaction, which in his case manifests as a slightly faster walk. I allowed myself nothing more than the quiet confirmation that the thing I had expected to happen had happened on schedule, in the manner anticipated. The criminal matter was proceeding on its own track. Sam's forensic specialist in Brentwood had completed his affidavit 3 weeks earlier, 14 pages documenting the signature inconsistencies with the specificity of a man who had spent a career explaining to courts why one person's name written by another person's hand is not, in fact, the same thing. Howard had submitted the complaint to Nashville PD. A detective had been assigned. 2 weeks after that, Derek had received a formal notice requiring his appearance. He called me the same evening the notice arrived. I did not pick up. The voicemail lasted 2 minutes and 19 seconds and covered several positions simultaneously, including that the transfer had been a misunderstanding, that Diane had verbally authorized everything, that I was misrepresenting a family arrangement, and that he was willing to discuss a resolution. The positions were not entirely consistent with each other, which told me more than any individual sentence did. A man with a clear account of his own actions does not need 4 different explanations for the same event. What I had not anticipated was what Derek did next, which was to go to Diane. He had apparently decided that the most efficient remaining path was to have her testify that she had given verbal authorization for the transfer. He went to the apartment she had been renting on East Nashville since the beginning of April, and he sat across from her at her kitchen table, and he told her that the whole situation was a misunderstanding that her signature on a simple statement could resolve. According to Diane, he was very calm about it, very reasonable. The version of Derek she had lived with for 9 years, the one who wore the composed surface and spoke in the register of a man explaining something obvious to someone slightly behind. She asked him to show her the authorization form. He had not brought it, which he described as an oversight. She asked him to describe exactly what it said. He gave her a description that did not match the document Sam had photographed. She had seen Sam's photograph by then, because I had sent it to her 2 days earlier through Howard, without comment or instruction, just the image and the caption, the authorization form submitted to the bank on the date in question. She recognized that the signature did not look like her signature. She told me later that she had known her own handwriting since she was 7 years old and had never once written a capital D that way in her life. Derek left the apartment without the statement he had come for. Diane sat at her kitchen table for a while, and then she called me. It was past 10 when my phone rang. I was in the study. She did not say hello. She said, "Dad," in the voice she used when she was 12, and something had gone wrong at school, and she needed to say the word before she could say anything else. I told her I was getting in the car. I drove to East Nashville, and we sat at her kitchen table until nearly 2 in the morning. We talked about the transfer and the signature and the court filing that had put her name on a motion she had never agreed to. We talked about the 18 months on Cedarwood Lane and the things she had believed about those months and the things that had actually been happening inside them. We talked about her mother, briefly, and about the years when I had not been as present as I should have been, and I did not attempt to reframe any of that. I had spent 35 years in a profession that requires you to accept a document as it is, not as you wish it were. At some point after 1 in the morning, the conversation quieted, and Diane looked at her hands on the table, and then she looked up at me and said, "Dad, what is this about an inheritance? Derek mentioned something a long time ago, about some money you were getting." I had been waiting for that question since February. I had been sitting with the answer for longer than I had been carrying the inheritance itself, because the answer was not only about money, it was about what the money meant and who I intended it to protect, and what I had built over the preceding months to make sure it arrived at the right people intact. I looked at her across that small kitchen table, in the apartment she had rented with her own money, after finally walking out of a situation she had defended longer than it deserved, and I thought, yes, now. "It is time you knew about all of it," I said, and for the first time since the night a truck hit me on I-65 and turned everything sideways, I smiled. By September, the house on Cedarwood Lane was quiet in the way it used to be, before Derek moved his particular brand of turbulence into the spare bedroom and called it a temporary arrangement. The mornings were cool again, the light on the back porch arriving at an angle that meant the season had turned, and I sat out there most mornings with coffee and the specific satisfaction of a man who had spent 6 months being systematic and could now sit still. Derek and Diane's divorce was finalized in August. The proceeding was not complicated, which is what happens when one party's assets turn out to consist primarily of outstanding debt. The $61,400 across 3 credit cards, the legal fees for Curtis Vane's services, which had not come cheap and had also not produced a single favorable outcome, the Smyrna land deal, which collapsed entirely when the seller voided the contract on grounds of fraudulent authorization, leaving Derek with no deposit return and no property, and a notation on the transaction record that would follow him into any future real estate dealings in Davidson County. After all of it was settled and tallied, Derek Powell walked out of a 9-year marriage with less than he had walked into it with, which is the financial summary of a man who had spent nearly a decade optimizing for an outcome that disappeared. The morning a document examiner in Brentwood looked at a signature and wrote 14 pages about what he saw. The criminal matter resolved in July. Derek accepted a plea arrangement with the district attorney's office. He repaid $18,000 to Diane's account, which I understood gave him some difficulty to arrange, and he received a suspended sentence of 18 months with conditions. He did not do any time. I had not expected him to, and I was not disappointed by it. What he received was a documented criminal record and a financial crater, and the knowledge that every professional reference and background check in his future would include a line about a forgery conviction in Davidson County, Tennessee. For a man whose entire operational method depended on presenting a surface of competence and reliability, I considered that adequate. The last time Derek called me was a Thursday evening in late August. I was on the back porch. I looked at the name on the screen for a moment, and then I answered, because I have always believed in finishing things properly. He spoke for about 40 seconds. He used the phrase, "move forward like adults," and something about closure, and something about how he hoped there were no hard feelings. The speech had clearly been rehearsed. It had the flat cadence of a man reading from notes he had written to sound spontaneous. I let him finish. Then I said, "Derek, you called the hospital and told the nurse on duty that I was a useless old fool who had brought it on myself. I was in room 412 with 3 broken ribs and a fractured collarbone, and that was your contribution to the situation." I paused for a beat because I have a sense of timing developed across 68 years of listening to people reveal themselves. I wrote it down. I tend to do that. Good luck to you. I ended the call and set the phone on the porch railing and watched a cardinal work its way along the fence at the back of the yard. The silence afterward was not dramatic. It was just silence, which is what silence is when you are no longer waiting for anything to resolve. $35 million sat in the Revocable Living Trust under Howard Blake's management, with Norma as secondary trustee. I had not bought a yacht. I had not relocated to a property with a better zip code. I had updated my fishing equipment, specifically a carbon fiber rod that cost $340 and performs at a level that continues to justify the purchase every single Saturday morning when I am standing on the bank of the Cumberland at 5:30, with nobody requiring anything of me. Diane had her share of the trust designated under terms she now knew in full. We had sat at her kitchen table on 2 more occasions after that first late night in April, and each time the conversation had been easier, not because the history was simpler, but because we had stopped pretending the history was something other than what it was. She was building a life in East Nashville that was hers, in a way the previous 9 years had not been, and I was watching that with the patience of a man who understands that some things take the time they take and cannot be accelerated without damaging the structure. Vanessa was a different and longer story, and I had made peace with the fact that longer stories require more chapters. We had met 8 times since March. The early meetings were uncomfortable in the specific way of 2 people who share something profound and also share almost no ordinary history, which means every conversation has to carry more weight than conversations are usually designed for. She cried twice. I came close once, which for me is a notable event. We had not resolved anything formally. There was no ceremony, no moment of official reconciliation, no document I could file. What there was accumulation. 8 meetings, none of which ended with either of us deciding not to have another one. The previous Saturday, she had joined me on the Cumberland for the first time. She arrived at 5:20 in the morning in boots that were not designed for riverbanks, carrying a coffee she had stopped for on the way because she had not been sure my coffee would be adequate, which suggested she was paying attention to who I was, which I found more encouraging than I expected to. She did not know how to fish. I did not attempt to teach her in any formal sense. We stood on the bank in the early light, and she watched the water, and I watched the line, and neither of us said very much, and after about an hour she said, "I think I understand why you do this." And I said, "Most people take longer than an hour." And she looked at me sideways and said, "I had a head start on patience. I waited 23 years for this." I had no immediate response to that, which does not happen to me often. I reeled in a few feet of line and thought about it, and finally said, "That is a fair point, Ness. That is a genuinely fair point." The Cumberland moved past us the way it always does, without interest in the particulars of the people standing on its bank, which is one of the things I have always appreciated about rivers. They do not require explanation, they simply continue. Norma came by on Sunday. We sat on the back porch, and she drank her tea, and I had my coffee, and she asked me, in the way she asks things when she already knows the answer but wants to hear me say it, whether I was all right. I told her I was better than all right. She nodded and looked at the yard and said she was glad and did not make it larger than it needed to be, which is the specific grace of a person who has been on your side long enough to know that you do not need the observation decorated. I went back inside at mid-morning. The map on the study wall, the 1847 survey of Middle Tennessee, hung exactly where it had always hung, even exact, indifferent to time. I had cataloged 5,000 documents in my career, maybe more. I had learned that the value of a thing is not what someone claims it is in the moment. It is what the record shows, accumulated over time, verified by sources that hold up, protected by a structure built before the question is asked. I sat down at the desk. I had a good cup of coffee. a quiet house, and a Saturday on the Cumberland to look forward to in 6 days. I also had $35 million in a trust that was arranged exactly as it should be. 2 daughters who were finding their way back to me through separate and complicated routes, and the durable satisfaction of a man who had been called a useless old fool by someone who had underestimated what a patient person with a good filing system is capable of. I picked up a pen, opened the notebook I keep on the left side of the desk, and wrote the date at the top of the page. Then I put the pen down and just sat there for a while, in the quiet, in my own house, on my own time. That was enough. If you like this story, subscribe to our new channel and listen to several stories there. You will find a link to it in the collaboration or description of this video, or in the comments. Subscribe so you don't lose us, because this channel will soon cease to exist.